Well, good afternoon and welcome to our April live virtual presentation for the Southeast Tennessee Resource Conservation and Development Council. My name is Seth Schaefer. I'm the Executive Director with the RC&D, or Southeast Tennessee RC&D. And joining me today is going to be Tammy Swihart. She's with the NRCS and she is the State Grazing Specialist. And today we are at Red Clay Farm. It's a certified organic farm in Bradley County, Cleveland, Tennessee. And behind me you can probably see we've got a couple of different types of livestock. The farm is kind of split between vegetable production as well as having different types of livestock. So behind me we can see we've got some horses as well as alpacas. The alpacas may look a little different than what you're used to seeing because they were just sheared yesterday. We took all their fiber off of them. So they look a little less menacing than they do when they're all bushy with all their winter growth. We've also got a bunch of chickens out here, as well as Jacob sheep and a few goats running around with some livestock guard dogs. So that's kind of a little bit of an overview of the type of livestock that is here on the farm. And so now I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Tammy, and she's going to take it away.
Okay, I don't know, we'll probably just go ahead and walk through and go ahead and get in the field. Yeah. Come over to this area and then we can have a discussion about what we see from the winter grazing management. So excuse me as we walk. For the winter, and providing the hay bales in the rain, and then actually just opening up the bales, letting them utilize those also. So what we want to kind of talk about first is what do we do after a winter like we've had, especially just the last 3 or 4 weeks. We've had a lot of rain, and so we've had a lot of mud. And no matter how large your operation is, you're probably dealing with some mud, some areas that are denuded from the vegetation, and something that you need to look at. What can I do with this spring to either bring it back if it's an area that you're going to use next to a barn every year for your winter sacrifice area, or where you're keeping your animals most of the time. And you may be just trying to look at something that you can get a quick cover to be able to protect the site so that it doesn't erode and you don't continue to have this packed mud in here. So one of the things we kind of want to look at today is just kind of that management situation that we can work with after we've come off one of these heavily used winter pasture areas. And you can kind of get an idea if you just kind of fan around a little bit. This is his main winter pasture on this side for the alpacas and the horses. And as you can see, it's down to the ground in most cases. We're getting to this point where we're going to start getting the spring flush in. We have a lot of weeds that are here, but this is an area that you would expect because it is a winter use area that is used every year. I don't know how many years that you've had them in this area.
It's going on to at least 10 to 12 years.
Okay, so 10 to 12 years. There's about 4 acres in here?
Roughly.
Yeah. Yes. In this area, we've probably run about 3 horses and about 10 alpacas usually?
Usually, yes.
In here. So, when you think about your animal forage ratio, you're going to look at it differently in a winter sacrifice area, of course, than you would on your normal pasture. But we know that containing them in this area for that length of time during the winter is going to beat down this area. And because of that, you start looking at what's going to come up. And if you can kind of see the ground cover here, for the most part, you've got some little, what we call POA, little bluegrass, annual bluegrass, but mainly this is the buttercup that's coming up. And that's really something that you see a lot and pastures that have been overgrazed, or areas just like we're looking at here that are wintered with animals, you know, at a fairly tight forage balance or animal balance. So what we want to try to look at here is what can we do with this site after this winter to be able to kind of bring it back, bring some of the vegetation back. Of course, number one, we're going to have to pull the animals off, and I know that's one thing that Seth works with is they have a field right across there that they utilize to have the animals on part-time, sometimes just a daily move, let them out there for a few hours, bring them back. But he's also got 2 or 3 other paddocks that he can rotate them in. So, you know, what we want to see is being able to get them off here, letting this have an opportunity to recover, because that's probably the most important thing about any of our pastures, whether it's in our heavy use areas or winter feeding areas, or if it's just our normal rotating pasture, is our recovery time and time that the animals are off of it and allows for that regrowth. And so to start out with, I want to talk just a little bit about grasses and legumes and regrowth. And so I'm going to grab the buttercup anymore. Let's see what I was thinking about doing. All right. So what I just want to show is when we talk about regrowth, this is a clover here, and I know you may not be able to see it close enough, but that's actually the root system, and then these are stolons that come out along the edge. So a lot of the clovers will put stolons run right along the ground, and then they'll shoot up their shoots from those. So when you're grazing or you're mowing for hay, you'll see clovers in a lot of fields where your grasses aren't coming back very good. The clovers will be thick, and that's because the clovers can take that abuse of mowing or grazing very, very short, because their stolons run right along the ground and they shoot right back up from it. So that's why, in a lot of times in those overgrazing situations, you'll see a lot of clover in the early spring coming back, because it can take that abuse. Most of your grasses, especially your cool season grasses, some grasses do have rhizomes that run under the ground. Fescue has minor small rhizomes, so it does help with the fescue plant, but you get like an orchard grass or timothy, and their growing point is coming from one stem, and basically what is occurring is that growing point is going to be normally at the node of that second leaf. So as that plant moves up, that node will move up. So what happens is, if we start grazing this plant down to an inch off the ground, all of a sudden we're below that node. And so every time that we do that with our grazing or with our haying, so we even got to think about haying as far as how low we're mowing that, is if we cut it off at that growing point, it has to go back to the root system to get its energy back to start putting that shoot back up. So the key there is, if we can continue, make sure that we don't graze below that growing point, or we don't hay below that growing point, then it's going to be able to have a good jump to be able to start back up and grow quickly. If not, it's got to go all the way down here, get these reserves, and send it back up. What also happens is, every time that you do that, so you know, we get it down, cut it or graze it to 1 inch, and then all of a sudden we go up, let it get up maybe 2 or 3 inches, and then we put them right back on there, and they do it again. Every time you do that, it's weakening this plant, and it's weakening its root system, because it's having to pull all of that storage energy from that root system back up to start sending up the shoot again. So that's where it's very, very important to try to keep your grazing or your mowing level at a point where usually 2 or 3 inches is the minimum you ever want to get. 4 to 5 inches is usually best for most grasses. Some of the fescue can take a little bit more, but your orchard grasses and timothy, not at all. If you start getting below that 3 to 4 inches each time. The other thing is recovery, like I mentioned before. You know, we've got a, if you go on, University of Kentucky has a great orchard grass demonstration where you actually see where it's been cut at 2 inches and the other one's been cut at 5 inches, and they do a time-lapse video, and you can see how quickly that 5-inch grows compared to the 2-inch. And so it really does show that when you cut it that low, that grass is stunted, and it's got to bring its reserves back up to be able to send that shoot back up. So that's really important to realize and know the importance of keeping your grass as tall as you can. Now, in every situation, just like what we've got here from wintertime, we're not going to have that option. During spring and summer, where you've got that opportunity to be able to move the animals and rotate the animals, you know, that's where you want to do your best to ensure that you keep the grasses to the point where maybe you don't move in on them until they're about 8 to 10 inches tall. There's a thing we always say, take half, leave half. So if you've got 8 to 10 inches when you start out, you can leave 4 or 5 when they leave. And so that's a really important thing to try to do when you're looking at your grazing management and ensuring that you're going to prolong your grass. So you're not having to come in and replant it, renovate it, you know, over time. You're making sure that you're allowing that root system and that grass to have an opportunity to continue to grow and flourish. And then the same thing here when we look at what happens when we lose our grasses in an area, you know, and our good forage for the animals, then we start getting the weeds come in. And you can kind of look out across here, if you would, Chase. You know, you can see some areas in here where it's dubbed down pretty low. They were probably getting the grasses in there really good. And then you'll see some areas where you've got some dead weeds that are sticking up through there. Little pockets of some good buttercup that's starting to come up. Those are areas that the animals are basically ignoring. They're grazing around. They're not specifically wanting to eat those because those are not going to be favorable species for them. And so you start getting those areas across the land. You get those little patches of where that grass or that weed is maturing because they're not going to take it, and then they're eating down, you know, to the ground as far as they possibly can all around it. And of course, what happens there too is then if you don't clip it, if you don't manage it, all of a sudden your weed species seed out and reestablish themselves. So, you know, it is important if you've got those weedy areas to not let them go to seed in the summer, to get out and clip them and knock them down. But just a few of the other species that I saw, this one is very common in just about all the pastures across Tennessee that I've seen. This is broom sedge, and of course this is a last year's plant here. You'll start seeing now about this tall, a little bit of some green coming through there. Animals, for the most part, whether it be alpacas or horses or sheep or cattle, do not prefer this. It's just very stemmy, and when it's young, they'll get those young shoots for a little bit, but then that'll be about it. So you'll see this a lot, and actually, if you look over to his corral over there, you can definitely see them growing up in there. The blue stem is a warm season grass, so you're going to see this time of year it's going to look dead. It'll be probably June or July before the new shoots will really start going crazy. And you know, with warm season grasses, even though broom sedge is not a favorable one for a lot of animals, there are some good native warm season grasses that you can plant that would provide excellent summer forage for the animals. That will help out in those situations where if you've got a lot of cool season grasses like fescue, orchard grass, they kind of go dormant, shut down in the summertime. Can be really concerned during drought times because, you know, you just don't have the good forage there available for the animals. That's where having a portion of your fields or area planted to like a native warm season grass, like a big blue stem, Indian grass, switchgrass, those type of grasses can help out because they grow so much more in summertime, and so much better than those cool season dormant grasses. Kind of gives you an opportunity to not only diversify the grasses in your operation, but provide what we call contingency. To have that contingency plan, so if we do go into a drought, you've got an area that you can put them on. Also, you have an opportunity to be able to what we call stockpile or save one of your other fields, like a fescue field, for later in the fall. Because if you eat it down during the summer, because that's the only place you can take them, and they have to deal with the drought, you're going to have problems with, just like we've talked about, that cool season grass being able to come back in the fall enough to provide you the forage that you need to get them into wintertime, when you may start feeding them hay. So it's one thing to really think about, but this is also an indicator, this broom sedge, besides being a grass they don't normally like, is usually a good indicator of poor fertility. And I don't know what you've done here as far as soil test or liming or fertilizer. If you want to just give us a quick...
Yeah, sure. So basically, for the hay field that you see behind me, with that one, we haven't lined it yet, but we have usually at least once or twice a year, depending on how things are looking. We do bring in about 4 or 5 tons of chicken litter, and we have it spread across that field, as well as some of our other fields that have been used for hay in the past. This one, because it has been primarily kept in as an animal pasture, we have not done anything to it as far as that type of fertilization goes. Obviously, you have the animals urinating and dropping the manures all over the pasture, but that's been about it as far as fertilization goes for this one.
Okay. So yeah, and he leads me right into another thing, thinking about how you utilize these animal pastures, these winter feeding areas, or those corral areas where you're keeping the animals a good portion of the time, whether it be in the winter time or other seasons, is looking at what we can do to help bring these back. Number one, as I was talking about with the broom sedge, usually there's a concern there with pH. You probably may have a low pH, or you may have low phosphorus in here if you see a lot of this broom sedge. The other thing is it just doesn't have the competition, because the cool season grasses are knocked down so much by the animals, and the fact that they don't prefer these get a chance to really take off and grow. I did see in, let me get over here, I don't know if you can see that well. I did see over in the pasture, or in the hay field where you've got some grass growing, there's some sweet vernal grass there. That is a grass that can overtake a lot of fields, and it's just not one that's very palatable to the animals. It can make some of them sick if that's all they have. Very minor though, not any kind of toxicity thing, but sweet vernal grass has a tendency to just take over pastures. Normally that's low fertility and overgrazing or over mowing with those. But then you do find some, we've got some native vetch that's coming in over there. It's doing real well. The vetch is great for providing some nitrogen for the grasses, and so that's really good to have mixed into the field there. So let's talk a little bit, since we're still here, let's look at this. One of the things Seth mentioned was distributing the manure and the urine. So if you're going to have the animals in a closed-in area, a paddock or a pasture for a good portion of time, how can we ensure that we're getting that urine and manure spread out? And that's the thing that I think we work with so much, especially with cattle operations, where we're closing them down to a sacrifice area. All of a sudden you have this muddy hay mess with manure and urine. And for the most part, if you don't have a heavy use area pad or concrete pad type situation, you can't really move it. It just gets hard and dry. You might be able to shovel it up, push it off a little bit, spread it out. But for the most part, you're containing it in those areas where you've got hay bales. The benefit he has here is he's got his hay bale, so he can drop them right off along the road, along the gate, or along the fence there, so that works out perfectly. You know, a thought here, especially if you're talking about having that area that you're going to have them in every year, is trying to make sure that you spread those hay bales out more than even what he's got them. You know, going across the field, and I know the benefit is being able to drop them over the fence. And you know, certain times of the year that may be your only choice because you just don't want to come in and drive through and damage the ground here. But some things that you can do to prepare for that is on dry days, either right when you're first bringing them in or right before you're going to be bringing them in for the winter season, is you can actually put your hay bales out. And you can fence around them or you know, block them just from use for a period of time if you don't want them, or you can start them in that area and move them back. You know, so I think that's one thing that is really important to look at, is not only for not having bare ground, not having ground that's overgrazed and beat down, but also for being able to distribute it or manure in our urines good enough across this whole area. So just looking at that, you know, he had a bale up there, up on top of the hill there, and there was a bale there, and I think there were some bales way in the back. So in this case, Seth has tried to move them around the field, but a lot of times what happens is all of a sudden it turns wet and you're stuck. So that's where you need to think about making sure that you put them in those places that you need them ahead of time. And for the most part, those bales aren't going to break down. They say for the most part, you know, 100 days, if you have them out 100 days or less, you're going to be fine. You're still going to be able to have plenty of the hay available for the animals. But that's probably the most important part, is being able to spread this out so that we get good uniformity across there. So what do you do now after winter's over and you're ready to start moving them to different fields? What are we going to do with these bare areas? You know, this is an excellent point in time where you do have a little bit of cover, but you've got a lot of bare ground. Certain areas very bare, but you know, patches through here. This is where, you know, you may want to look at interseeding something. Perhaps an annual. You could do an annual cover crop type thing. The benefit of the annual cover crop is if you're going to utilize this pasture again in the summer, you could come in with like a sorghum Sudan grass, pearl millet, cowpea mix type thing, and you can actually plant that into this ground here to be able to provide that summer crop, because those grow well in the summertime when your cool season grasses like your fescues going dormant. Gives you that opportunity to not only help rebuild and protect this ground here, but be able to provide some summer forage. Sometimes folks will keep the animals off and just cut that forage for hay, and provide that hay for the animals. Another great thing to do here is maybe plant the crabgrass. Crabgrass is a weed, and for a lot of folks, they don't want to see those in their yard. But crabgrass is actually a pretty darn good grass for cattle and sheep especially to eat. It's a summer annual, so it grows pretty fast, provides that quick growth that you need to be able to protect the site, and will provide some feed for the animals. And then even though it's an annual, it is really good at reseeding itself. So it'll come back from year to year if it's not abused. And it is one of those that the warm season annuals they'll be a little bit higher up for that node. So, you know, you want to keep them a little bit higher if you're mowing them or grazing them. You want to keep them a little bit higher, not as high as the native warm season grasses. The native warm season grasses are important to make sure because that node moves up the stem as they grow to keep them more at that 10 to 12 inch height with that. But with the crabgrass, you know, it can come in and it can make a huge difference on the site. But the importance, I think, on all of this is that recovery time. When can we bring them back to be able to forage on the ground. And for the most part, when you're doing a new establishment, you really want 60 days before you ever think about bringing them back. For a rotational system, most of the grasses, if you're in like a 30-day rotation, and I say not 30-day rotation, but you don't bring them back to that field for a month, that is probably going to be a good timing, depending on the season. You know, spring you're going to have a little bit faster growth, and so you may be able to move them every 20 days back into that same pasture again. You start getting later in the season, and in the summer, especially with cool season, you may wait 30 to 45 days before you bring them back in. But the option there is to ensure that you've got your grazing system set up management-wise, that you can allow that recovery on those fields, and you can move them. Now, you may look at it and say, you know, I've really only got 3 fields with fences. You know, how do I do that? Well, that's when you start looking at, you know, can I cross fence? Can I put some temporary fence up and just kind of move them into smaller areas, rotate them a little bit quicker? So maybe if you were in a rotation where you were moving them every 30 days, you start looking at, can I move them every 2 weeks? Or can I move them every week? Or, you know, we've got some intensive management, you know, rotational grazings where we're moving them daily. You know, just depending on your situation and the number of animals you're dealing with and what time that you have, it's going to be, you know, what's going to make a difference in how you can rotate. But it still comes back to that contingency. We need to make sure that, you know, I always kind of say you've got one more paddock than you really need, because you need that paddock that you've got rested, prepared if we get wet season, where some of these areas that had been beat down for winter or whatever just become a muddy muck. You got to get them out. You're causing so much damage from compaction from the hooves on those fields. You got to find a little bit drier area that they've not been on, even if it's just an area in the back of the field that you've just ran some temporary fence and kept them out of. You know, having that area is going to be very, very important to the animals and to the forage of your ground, and being able to protect that land. Same thing in the summertime. You know, if we get a really droughty period and you set aside a paddock or a portion of the field and kept them out of it, you're going to have that grass available for them to be able to move into. So that is really the key to the whole grazing management, is not so much, you know, how much am I rotating, but the recovery time for the fields, and having that contingency plan that you can ensure that you've got a place that you can take those animals if you're in an overgrazing situation due to the wetness or drought or whatever it could be with that. Time-wise, I want to double check with that.